Hello and welcome to this whirlwind presentation of periodization and considerations for amateur boxing. Today we are going to talk about what periodization is, how can we use it within the context of amateur boxing specifically, and what requirements do we have for competitive success in this sport, and how can periodization enhance our performance in not only training, but also relative to other important aspects of performance, such as nutrition, psychology, etc. We won't have too much time to touch on other things, but we will provide a couple of examples at the end. So amateur boxing is a combat sport, and the athlete's objective is to land punches with sufficient force while avoiding being counterpunched. The boxer will fight for a given number of intervals called rounds, and typically they last 3 minutes, and there are 3 of them with a 1-minute rest in between. And during that 1-minute rest, the boxer will take instructions from the coach on what to do in the subsequent round. Amateur boxing is also an Olympic sport, meaning it runs on an Olympic quadrennial cycle, but that is beyond the purview of this presentation. We are going to be giving examples of a 1-year macro plan. So before we talk about periodization for boxing, we need to talk about what it actually is. So periodization is basically the process of dividing a training program into specific phases or periods, which we'll go over in more detail in the next slide. Periodization is used for 2 different aspects of training. One is the periodization of the actual plan, where you're dividing the training into specific phases. And the other one is the periodization of biomotor abilities, such as developing speed, endurance, power, strength, things like that, things that are important for excelling in the sport. There are another 2 key characteristics of periodization, which is an emphasis on higher training volumes towards the beginning of a training phase or a season, and then higher intensities with lower volumes as competition approaches, as well as when competition approaches, a reduction in training variation and a move towards more specific training as we head into that important competition that we've been working towards. Now, there are 3 big main phases of periodization, which we will go over in more detail. The first one is the preparatory phase, the second one is the actual competitive phase, and the final one is the transition phase. So the preparatory phase can be further subdivided into 2 sub-phases, one called general preparation, which is at the beginning of the season, and then there's specific preparation getting closer towards the competitive phase. Now, the primary focus of this phase is building a strong physiological foundation for the boxer's overall development. It helps, not only does that help the athlete prepare for higher training loads, but it also helps them deal with the competitive demands of the sport within season. Technical and tactical training is also introduced here, but it's not prioritized as much because we're just getting into building our base. Next, we have the competitive season. This is characterized by a drop in training volume and an increase in training intensity and a peak for the competition itself. Training also shifts from a more general to emphasize a more sport-specific training that mimics the competitive demands more closely. This phase sees an increase in sport-specific drills, sparring, things that are, done at a competition pace in general. Finally, we have the transition phase, and this is referred to as many as the off-season. And this phase is characterized by reductions in volume and intensity, as well as specificity. When we've done, sport-specific training for an extended period of time, this can put us at risk for things like staleness, overuse, injuries, and psychological burnout. So we do need to take regular extended breaks from training in the beginning. Now, that doesn't mean that we completely stop moving, that generally some general physical conditioning is still kept up during this phase. And specifically for boxing, we try not to gain too much excess body fat with varying degrees of success, because that makes the preparatory phase pretty rough if we come back after having gained, a good 10 pounds over the off season. And then we also do maintain a little bit of sport specificity if the coach has identified some technical flaws that we might need to work on during the transition phase to augment our performance in the subsequent season. So periodization is key to managing training loads, reducing the risk of injury, and peaking for important competitions. So before creating a periodized plan for the boxer, we need to be familiar with the sport and the physical demands of training and competition, which segues us nicely into what are the actual physical demands of training and competition. And over here, we've got a needs analysis of the biomotor abilities required for success in the sport. The first one is aerobic endurance. Now, a solid aerobic base is the foundation upon which many other physical qualities are built and rely. So without a well-developed aerobic system, the boxer can't recover between rounds or in between those intermittent high-intensity exchanges that you see in competition, let alone from the training itself, because the sport is highly demanding and you need a good physiological foundation to be able to manage that training load. The anaerobic endurance side of it only makes up 25% of the contribution, as we'll see, but without this a solid anaerobic base development, the athlete will struggle to kick into that fifth gear necessary for those high intensity exchanges and the strength and power that supports. So again, strength and power is extremely important in boxing. If you're not very strong or powerful, you will probably get bullied in the ring, and if you are more likely to get a stoppage or make it a little bit more difficult for your opponent to just walk you down. And then we've got muscular endurance, which is important for maintaining your form and your technical ability under fatigue. And then finally, we have speed and reactive agility. So this is your ability to react to sport-specific stimulus. And obviously, speed of punches is super fast. So we need to be able to develop a lot of speed to support, not only the quickness of the punches, but also those sudden changes in direction in response to that sport-specific stimuli. These are the physiological demands of boxing. So we can see that predominantly this is an aerobic sport, and about 25% of it is anaerobic, and we should program accordingly. Now that we've figured out, based on our needs analysis, what we actually need to have competitive success in the sport, we need to figure out how we're going to measure and evaluate those physical qualities that maximize that performance. So we choose some testing protocols, and the results of which will be analyzed to find weaknesses in the athlete's overall performance, and also to evaluate how well the program that we just implemented, if we're testing at the end of a training phase, to see how successful that program is at getting what we wanted out of it. One caveat I just wanted to quickly touch on is physical ability aside, boxing is a highly tactical sport, and so the need for physical ability is important, but at the highest levels, everyone is physically quite able, and so tactics come into it a lot. Here is an example of how we would monitor the testing battery across the competitive season. So we have all our tests, our dates, our names of our athletes, and we just keep it in a spreadsheet. That's probably the easiest way to monitor training. The first physical test should be carried out at the start of the season again, so in the beginning of the preparatory phase, and then after each relevant training phase beyond that, to assess how successful that phase was at getting what we were looking for out of it. here we have a few examples of zooming out to the macro cycle, and the period of interest here is the competitive season in boxing. It goes from August to June. And in this example, we have two important competitions that we are trying to peak for. And we can see that all the phases and the sub-phases are divided into specific weeks, and the general focus of the training is listed there. The next level down, zooming in, we have the mesocycle, which is, this can be anywhere between 2 weeks and several months, depending on the sport and the plan and where we are relative to competition. So I've just put two examples here of different phases within two mesocycles, so a specific preparatory and a pre-competitive, just to show the difference, to show, at the end of this one, because we're quite far from competition, we might have a testing battery here, but because here we're right in the thick of getting ready for competition, we're going to have a taper instead. Then we have the microcycle, which is the smallest unit, which is basically a week of training. It outlines the specific things that we are going to do to achieve whatever biomotor ability or technical, tactical thing we are trying to work on in a given cycle, and they all kind of flow into each other. I just wanted to touch on a couple of other things related to boxing, and that is the importance of rest and recovery. And I've just got the fitness fatigue model to demonstrate how, as you get fitter from baseline, you also increase your fatigue, which decreases your performance. And in order to increase the performance again, you need to take regular rest to recover, and then this supercompensation effect will occur. And then you've got examples of how you could periodize even nutrition for boxing, which is quite important given that it's a weight-based sport and the training demands will require quite sound nutrition. So we've got an example here about how someone might periodize their carbs based on how intense the session is. And then just putting all of that together, those couple of examples, here is how you might integrate a periodized plan for boxing. So you don't have to necessarily just periodize the training. That is only one aspect of overall performance. Also, you can periodize things like recovery, nutrition, even psychological skills training for optimal performance. And we're seeing this more and more happen as, sports science progresses. So thank you for listening to that whirlwind tour of periodization for boxing. I had 10 minutes and 20 slides, so I know it was a little bit rushed, but I hope that you got a lot out of that, and I wish you all the best in your boxing journey.